Most of what an avoidant calls love never actually reaches dangerous depth. It stays shallow enough to control, manageable enough to walk away from without much internal cost, comfortable in the specific way that only things without real stakes can be comfortable. And then, every so often, something different happens. Something that doesn't behave like their usual relationships at all. Something that burrows past every defense they've spent a lifetime perfecting and lodges itself somewhere they can't easily reach or remove. When this happens, it isn't random, and it isn't simply a matter of chemistry or good timing. There are specific, identifiable reasons certain connections manage to reach this rare, dangerous depth, while so many others never come close. And understanding those reasons explains something that likely felt confusing and unexplainable while it was actually happening. This exploration is going to walk through 3 of the most significant reasons an avoidant can fall into a depth of love they never planned for, never fully controlled, and, in many cases, never quite recovered from cleanly. None of these reasons require the other person to have done anything manipulative or calculated. In fact, as this entire piece will show, the opposite is almost always true. The reasons an avoidant falls this deep tend to have very little to do with strategy, and everything to do with a kind of accidental, powerful authenticity that most people never even realize they're offering. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular depth of feeling deserves to be called dangerous rather than simply significant or memorable, because the word matters here. It's dangerous specifically for the avoidant experiencing it, not for anyone else. It's dangerous because it threatens the entire defensive architecture they've built their adult life around. Dangerous because it introduces a level of exposure and vulnerability their nervous system has spent years learning to avoid at nearly any cost. And dangerous because, once experienced, it tends to become a permanent point of comparison against which every subsequent relationship gets measured, often unfavourably, for years or even decades afterward. This isn't danger in the sense of harm being inflicted on anyone else. It's danger in the sense of genuine risk to the only internal system the avoidant has ever known how to rely on for a sense of safety. Anyone listening who has wondered whether a specific connection with an avoidant partner was ever really as significant as it felt, or whether that significance was something imagined, exaggerated by hope, into something that was never actually there, deserves to hear this laid out clearly. Because what follows offers a fairly precise, psychologically grounded explanation for exactly the kind of depth being described. It's also worth saying, before moving into the specific reasons themselves, that recognizing these patterns in a past relationship is not an invitation to reopen it, chase it, or treat this explanation as a reason to remain emotionally available to someone who may never close the gap between the depth they felt and the presence they were able to offer. This distinction will be revisited throughout this exploration, but it deserves to be stated clearly from the outset, so that everything explained afterward gets received as the accurate, closure-oriented information it's actually meant to provide, rather than as encouragement to keep waiting for an outcome that clarity alone can never guarantee. The first reason involves something that sounds simple on the surface, but carries enormous psychological weight underneath it. The experience of being offered safety without any accompanying demand for change. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in explaining why certain connections reach a depth most avoidant relationships never touch. Because most people, even people who love an avoidant deeply and patiently, eventually, understandably, begin asking for something different. More communication, more consistency, more emotional availability than the avoidant currently knows how to offer. This asking isn't unreasonable, and it isn't wrong. It's simply human, a natural response to loving someone whose distance creates genuine pain over time. But this asking, however justified, tends to trigger an avoidant's deepest fear almost immediately, the fear of being fundamentally inadequate exactly as they are. A fear so old and so deeply embedded that even gentle, loving requests for more closeness often land as confirmation of that inadequacy, rather than as reasonable, healthy relational communication. This is part of why avoidant relationships so often become locked into an exhausting cycle, request met with retreat, retreat met with more urgent requests, urgency met with further retreat. A pattern that rarely produces depth and far more often produces exactly the kind of manageable, controlled distance avoidants default toward in most of their relationships. The rare connections that reach dangerous depth tend to break this cycle at its root. Not through the other person suppressing their own needs entirely, which would create its own separate, unhealthy dynamic, but through a specific quality of acceptance that somehow coexists with genuine self-respect. This is a difficult balance to strike, and it's precisely because it's so difficult, so rare, that its presence tends to produce such an outsized effect when it does appear. It involves someone capable of holding real boundaries, real self-worth, and real standards for how they deserve to be treated, while simultaneously offering the avoidant something they've almost never received elsewhere: the felt sense that who they currently are, guarded, imperfect, still working through whatever created their distance in the first place, is not something requiring immediate correction in order to be worthy of love. This combination, boundaries alongside genuine acceptance, is what actually disarms an avoidant's usual defenses far more effectively than either boundaries alone or acceptance alone ever could. Boundaries alone, without accompanying warmth, tend to feel like rejection, triggering the avoidant's fear of inadequacy just as intensely as direct criticism might. Acceptance alone, without any accompanying boundaries, tends to feel less like safety and more like an absence of real stakes, something an avoidant can take for granted precisely because nothing about the dynamic requires them to show up consistently in order to maintain it. It's the specific combination of both together that creates something genuinely rare: safety significant enough to lower an avoidant's guard, paired with enough self-respect to ensure that guard, once lowered, encounters something worth staying present for, rather than something to immediately retreat from once safety has been confirmed. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent their entire life bracing for impact every time they walk through a doorway, flinching instinctively, expecting some kind of collision or obstacle every single time, because that's simply what doorways have always produced in their experience. Then imagine this same person encountering a doorway that, for the first time, opens smoothly, without resistance, without any of the usual impact they've been braced for their entire life. The relief in that moment isn't ordinary relief. It's something closer to disorientation, because their entire nervous system has been organised around expecting a completely different outcome. This is close to what an avoidant experiences when they encounter this rare combination of acceptance and boundaries for the first time. A doorway that finally opens the way doorways were always supposed to open, without the impact they'd spent their whole life bracing against. It's worth pausing here to offer something important to anyone listening who recognises themselves as the person who offered exactly this kind of acceptance, who held their own boundaries while still extending genuine, unforced warmth towards someone who struggled enormously to receive it. This wasn't a small thing, and it wasn't easy, even if it may have felt, in the moment, like simply being yourself, rather than performing some deliberate strategy. Offering this specific combination requires a level of internal security that many people, understandably, haven't developed. And the fact that it came naturally, or even that it required real effort to maintain, doesn't diminish how significant its impact actually was. This quality is precisely what created the conditions for the kind of depth being explored throughout this entire piece, and it deserves to be recognised as the genuine strength it actually represents, rather than dismissed as simply good luck or fortunate timing. It helps to name what this first reason actually tends to look like in observable, day-to-day terms, because the abstract description of safety without demand can be difficult to recognise without something more concrete attached to it. This quality often shows up as a kind of patient, unhurried quality in how difficult conversations get approached. A willingness to name a concern honestly, without attaching that concern to an ultimatum or an implied threat of withdrawal. It shows up as genuine curiosity about an avoidant's inner world, offered without the anxious undertone of trying to extract reassurance. Curiosity motivated by real interest, rather than by a need to manage one's own uncertainty about where the relationship stands. It also tends to show up in how mistakes get handled, met with directness about impact rather than punishment, correction offered as information rather than as a verdict on the avoidant's fundamental worth as a person. This particular quality, correction without condemnation, deserves special attention because it's one of the more difficult balances to strike consistently, and it's precisely the balance most avoidants have almost never encountered in their prior relationships. Most people, when hurt by an avoidant's distance or inconsistency, understandably let some of that hurt bleed into how they communicate about it. A sharper tone, an implied accusation, a subtle suggestion that the avoidant's behaviour reflects some deeper flaw in their character. This is an entirely human, understandable response to pain, but it also tends to confirm the exact fear driving the avoidant's defences in the first place, that their true self, once fully seen, will be found inadequate and rejected. Someone capable of naming hurt honestly, while still communicating, clearly and consistently, that the avoidant's fundamental worth isn't in question, offers something genuinely rare and genuinely destabilising in the most productive sense to an avoidant's usual defensive expectations. The second reason an avoidant can fall into this kind of dangerous depth involves something almost paradoxical, and it requires unpacking carefully because it contradicts a common, oversimplified assumption about how avoidant attraction actually works. It's worth naming, briefly, why this paradox tends to surprise so many people trying to understand avoidant behaviour from the outside. Most popular advice about attracting or keeping an avoidant's interest focuses heavily on the idea of playing hard to get, deliberately limiting availability, or strategically withholding communication in order to trigger pursuit. This advice, while occasionally effective at producing shallow, temporary interest, almost never produces the kind of dangerous depth being described throughout this exploration, precisely because it's built on manufactured scarcity rather than genuine wholeness. Manufactured scarcity, once detected, tends to read to an avoidant as exactly what it is, a strategy oriented around producing a specific reaction, which, paradoxically, reintroduces the very dynamic of being needed and managed that dangerous depth actually requires the absence of. The assumption goes something like this. Avoidants are drawn to people who chase them, who pursue relentlessly, who create the kind of intermittent reinforcement that keeps them hooked without requiring genuine investment in return. This assumption isn't entirely wrong, and it does explain a great deal of shallow, manageable, avoidant attraction, the kind that stays comfortable and controllable, precisely because it never demands anything beyond occasional, minimal engagement. But dangerous depth operates according to a different, almost opposite mechanism. It tends to develop most powerfully not toward people who chase, but toward people who don't need to be chased at all. People whose sense of worth and completeness clearly doesn't depend on the avoidant's attention, approval, or presence. This distinction matters enormously because it explains a pattern that confuses many people trying to understand why an avoidant fell so deeply for someone who never behaved anxiously or desperately toward them, while treating previous partners, who may have pursued far more actively, with comparative indifference. The reason for this involves something fundamental about how avoidants experience their own value within a relationship. Most of an avoidant's relational history involves being pursued by people whose emotional stability seems, at least partially, contingent on the avoidant's continued presence and attention. This creates an unconscious but powerful dynamic where the avoidant becomes, in some sense, responsible for another person's emotional equilibrium, a responsibility that feels suffocating precisely because it echoes the exact kind of engulfment their entire defense structure was built to avoid. Even when this pursuit is flattering in the moment, it tends to reinforce the avoidant's underlying fear that closeness inevitably means becoming responsible for managing someone else's need. A person whose emotional stability clearly doesn't depend on the avoidant, someone with a full, meaningful life, genuine interests, real friendships, and a sense of identity that exists entirely independent of the relationship, removes this particular burden completely. The The avoidant isn't being asked, even implicitly, to manage anyone else's well-being. They're simply being invited into a connection with someone whole, someone who wants their presence rather than needing it to feel complete. This distinction, wanting versus needing, sounds subtle when stated plainly, but it produces a dramatically different internal experience for an avoidant, one built on genuine choice rather than obligation. And choice, unlike obligation, doesn't trigger the same defensive retreat that has governed most of their previous relationships. There's something worth naming here about why this particular quality feels so rare and, once encountered, so difficult for an avoidant to walk away from easily. Most people, even genuinely secure people, tend to soften their own boundaries and independence somewhat once real feelings develop, a natural, ordinary part of falling for someone. But the specific person capable of triggering this dangerous depth in an avoidant tends to maintain their own wholeness even as feelings deepen, not through coldness or deliberate emotional withholding, but through a genuine, settled sense of self that simply doesn't waver based on how the relationship unfolds. This consistency, maintained without becoming rigid or unavailable, is precisely what an avoidant has almost never encountered before. And its rarity is a significant part of why it produces such a powerful, lasting impact. There's a metaphor worth holding here as well. Picture someone who has spent their entire life believing that anyone who gets close enough will eventually need to be held up, supported, managed. The way a person might need to hold up something structurally unstable to prevent it from collapsing. This belief shapes every interaction, creating constant, low-grade vigilance, an unconscious bracing for the moment support will be required. Then imagine this same person encountering something entirely different, someone who doesn't need holding up at all, who stands entirely on their own, regardless of what happens in the relationship. The relief in this discovery isn't just comfort, it's closer to disbelief, followed by a kind of magnetic pull towards something that finally, for the first time, doesn't require constant vigilance and management in order to remain stable. It's worth naming a caution here, because this explanation could easily be misread as suggesting that maintaining distance, coldness, or deliberate emotional withholding is the key to attracting deep avoidant love. This would be a serious misunderstanding of what's actually being described. The quality that produces this effect isn't distance or coldness at all. It's genuine warmth combined with genuine wholeness, presence without dependency, engagement without need. Someone who deliberately withholds warmth as a strategy to seem more independent or desirable isn't offering the same thing being described here. They're simply performing independence while secretly hoping it produces a specific reaction. And avoidants, as discussed in other explorations of this topic, tend to be unusually skilled at detecting exactly this kind of performance, precisely because they've spent so much of their own life managing similarly performed emotional presentations. What actually produces dangerous depth is authentic wholeness, not strategic withholding disguised as wholeness. And the difference between these two things, while sometimes subtle in description, tends to be immediately, viscerally obvious to the person experiencing it. It helps to describe what genuine wholeness actually tends to look like in practice, distinct from performed independence, because the distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to understand which category their own behaviour actually fell into during a particular relationship. Genuine wholeness tends to show up as an ability to express real disappointment or hurt when an avoidant withdraws, without that expression collapsing into anxious pursuit or escalating into punishment. It shows up as a continued investment in one's own friendships, interests, and personal goals throughout the relationship, not as a deliberate strategy to appear busy or unavailable, but as an authentic continuation of a full life that was never actually centered entirely on the relationship to begin with. It shows up too in how someone responds when an avoidant does eventually offer vulnerability or closeness, meeting it with genuine warmth and engagement rather than with the kind of relieved, almost desperate overinvestment that can subtly communicate just how much the avoidant's presence was actually being relied upon all along. This last point deserves particular attention because it explains a subtle but important distinction between wholeness and simply appearing calm on the surface while still, underneath, remaining highly dependent on the relationship's outcome. An avoidant tends to sense this underlying dependency, even when it isn't expressed outwardly, through small shifts in tone, timing, or attentiveness that reveal more than any deliberate performance of calm ever could hide. Genuine wholeness isn't primarily a performance at all. It's a settled internal state that simply doesn't require concealment, because there's nothing anxious underneath it that needs to be hidden in the first place. The third reason an avoidant can fall into this rare, dangerous depth of love involves something that operates on a longer timescale than the first two reasons, and it requires looking closely at what happens specifically over extended, sustained exposure to a particular kind of consistency, one that most avoidant relationships never last long enough to actually establish. This reason involves the slow, cumulative effect of witnessing someone's reliability play out across many small moments, rather than any single dramatic gesture or grand display of commitment. Avoidants, because of their own relational history, tend to carry a deep, largely unconscious skepticism toward promises, declarations, and grand romantic gestures, having learned, often through painful earlier experience, that intensity in the moment rarely predicts consistency over time. This skepticism functions as a kind of protective filter, one that dismisses most attempts at connection as either temporary or unreliable, regardless of how sincere those attempts might genuinely be. This is part of why avoidants often seem unmoved by declarations of love or commitment that would deeply affect someone with a more secure attachment history. The declaration itself doesn't carry much weight, because their entire relational history has taught them that declarations and actual follow-through exist as two almost entirely separate categories of behaviour. What does carry weight, and what tends to accumulate slowly into the kind of dangerous depth being described throughout this exploration, is sustained, unglamorous reliability, shown consistently across ordinary, unremarkable circumstances, rather than through crisis or dramatic gesture. This might look like showing up, again and again, in small, quiet ways that never require acknowledgement or reward. It might look like remaining steady through an avoidant's inevitable moments of withdrawal, without either collapsing into anxious pursuit or retaliating with matching coldness. It might look like simply continuing to be present, reliably and without much fanfare, across weeks and months where nothing particularly dramatic happens at all, the ordinary texture of daily life rather than any single defining moment. This kind of consistency operates almost like evidence accumulating slowly in a case an avoidant's skeptical, protective mind has been building against the possibility of real, dependable love for their entire adult life. Each instance of reliability chips away, slightly, at the underlying assumption that closeness inevitably leads to disappointment or abandonment. No single instance produces this shift on its own. It's the accumulation, the sheer, patient repetition of reliability across enough time and enough ordinary circumstances that eventually produces a genuine, if gradual, revision of the avoidant's deepest expectations about what love actually is and whether it can be trusted to remain stable. There's a metaphor worth holding here as well, because it captures something important about how this specific kind of depth develops differently than the first two reasons already discussed. Picture water slowly, patiently carving a path through solid stone, not through any single dramatic force, but through the sheer, unglamorous persistence of the same motion repeated over an extended period of time. No single drop of water accomplishes anything visible on its own. It's only the accumulation, the consistency maintained across a timescale most people wouldn't have the patience to sustain, that eventually reshapes something as solid and resistant as stone. This is close to what sustained reliability does to an avoidant's deeply entrenched skepticism about love and consistency. It isn't fast, and it isn't dramatic, but it's remarkably effective, precisely because it operates through patient repetition rather than through any single forceful attempt at persuasion. It's worth naming something important here for anyone listening who spent an extended period of time offering exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous consistency to an avoidant partner, often without any clear acknowledgement that it was working, or any visible sign that it was producing the deep, cumulative effect being described here. This lack of visible acknowledgement during the relationship itself doesn't mean the consistency wasn't registering. As already discussed throughout this exploration, avoidants are often remarkably poor at translating internal experience into visible, real-time expression, which means the absence of clear gratitude or recognition during the relationship is not reliable evidence that the reliability being offered wasn't deeply significant. In many cases, it was significant precisely because of its consistency, and its significance simply remained invisible until circumstances, often the relationship's ending, finally forced it into conscious awareness. There's a physiological dimension worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why sustained consistency produces such a durable, lasting effect, rather than simply being a nice quality that fades from memory over time. Trust, at a basic physiological level, tends to build through repeated experience, rather than through any single event, regardless of how significant that single event might feel in the moment. Each instance of reliability, however small or unremarkable, contributes to a kind of cumulative recalibration in how safe a person's nervous system perceives another individual to be, gradually shifting baseline expectations through repetition rather than through persuasion or declaration. This is true for everyone, not just avoidants, but it carries particular significance for someone whose baseline expectation, formed over years of relational disappointment, already assumes that closeness eventually leads to instability or abandonment. For this baseline expectation to shift meaningfully, evidence has to accumulate across enough repetitions and across enough time that the nervous system can no longer easily dismiss it as an anomaly or an exception. This is precisely why consistency, sustained across weeks and months, tends to produce a considerably more durable, lasting impact than even the most passionate, well-intentioned declaration offered in a single moment. Declarations can be processed, filed away, and eventually dismissed by a skeptical mind looking for reasons not to trust them. Sustained, repeated experience is much harder to dismiss in the same way because it isn't a single claim requiring belief. It's an accumulating body of evidence that eventually becomes difficult to explain away, using the same old defensive narratives an avoidant has relied on throughout their entire relational history. This explains too why the depth of feeling produced by this third reason tends to persist so much longer after a relationship ends than feelings produced by more momentary, intense experiences might. Because this particular kind of trust was built slowly, through genuine, repeated evidence rather than through a single persuasive event, it tends to resist the kind of quick reframing and minimization avoidants typically apply to their past relationships. The evidence accumulated too gradually and too thoroughly to be dismissed easily, which means its impact tends to linger, sometimes for years, as a kind of permanent revision to what the avoidant now understands is actually possible in a relationship, even if they never manage to recreate those same conditions again with anyone else. It's worth pausing to address something important before moving further, because everything explored throughout this piece carries a real risk of being applied too generously, retrofitted onto a relationship that didn't actually contain all three of these specific qualities, simply because doing so feels more comforting than the alternative. Honest self-assessment matters considerably more here than flattering interpretation, and it's worth taking a moment to examine each of these three reasons rigorously, rather than assuming all three applied simply because the relationship in question felt significant or painful.